know, there was drugs and there was sex and there was debauchery and there was great, great rock music.
There she goes again.
You can't see the Velvet Underground without thinking experimental rock pioneers.
She's down on her knees.
It's so intoxicating, that music. It's very romantic music, but at the same time, it's just fascinating. It's evocative of other worlds.
Now take a look, there's no tears in her eyes.
In 1964, Welsh musician John Cale moved to New York to join the avant-garde scene that was developing there. He was taken under the wing of composer Lamont Young.
John Cale was obviously a big deal in British modern classical music. He was sponsored to go over to New York by Aaron Copland, so that sort of shows you what kind of world he was operating in. Lamont Young believed that there were more than 24 hours in a day, and therefore you didn't have to make music that conformed to a 3-minute song or a 7-minute song. You could make it go on for hours and hours and hours. And I think John Cale was particularly turned on by this idea of the drone that they had in music, which is basically just a note that's dragged out. It had a psychological effect on listeners and players that kind of took you into another dimension, and that's what Cale was really interested in at the time.
Lou Reed, an in-house songwriter for New York's Pickwick Records, was introduced to Cale whilst playing in an ad hoc band put together by the label called The Primitives.
Lou Reed was kind of a songwriter for hire. He was just writing songs to order. By his own admission, he didn't think he was particularly good at it, although subsequent examples of his work will prove that wrong. And you know, when you're a writer of that age, you're always looking for things to inspire you and things that are slightly different from what you're used to.
He was looking at Motown songs, he was looking at Lamont Dozier songs, you know, he was looking at the structure of how it works, the Brill Building songs, you know, Carole King and Jerry Goffin. He was coming from that background.
Folk artists like Bob Dylan and Joni Mitchell, and also blues artists. They were listening to a lot of blues records at the time. And John Cale definitely brought in a sort of very avant-garde, minimalist composer influence into the mix.
Cale and Reed had a really interesting relationship. I think throughout their career they were kind of friends one moment and then they were falling out the next. I think what made them really amazing as a partnership and as a duo was that Cale had this really experimental side and Lou Reed had the more pop kind of singer-songwriter side. So I think putting those two together made for a really interesting combination.
You've got this juxtaposition of Lou Reed's 1950s rock and roll on the radio upbringing and the fact that he was a jobbing songwriter for Pickwick. And then you've got John Cale's modern classical stuff. So there's possibly a meeting of influences that have never quite been seen before.
In terms of personalities as well, I imagine it was really interesting in the studio, both of them pulling in different directions, but then pushing music forward at the same time.
New York is suffering a news blackout with 9 major newspapers strike-bound.
New York City in the mid-60s was an economic and social decay. It was plagued by strikes, blackouts and riots. The city was nearing bankruptcy, and Reed, the poet, wasn't going to shy away from writing about his surroundings.
The great thing about Lou Reed was like, I'm not going to sugarcoat anything for you. I'm going to tell you what I see on the streets. I'm going to tell you about characters that I encounter. I'm going to tell you about addictions that I suffer from or embrace. You know, it was really just warts and all.
It was the 60s, it was all kind of peace and like free love and hippies and people in flares and flowers in their hair and things. And the Velvet Underground were completely different to that. I think what was interesting about them was they explored the kind of dark underbelly of what was going on. So maybe the stuff that people weren't talking about, but that was actually going on underneath, that's what the Velvet Underground kind of represented. So it was kind of drug abuse and prostitution and kind of the darker side of life. And people weren't interested in talking about that at the time, but actually it was happening. And the Velvet Underground just kind of held a little mirror up showing exactly what was going on.
It was definitely people who were living in a grimy, dirty city and living in grimy, dirty places as a reaction to the perceived hippy-dippy, let's love one another and take our clothes off thing that was going on in California. It was definitely a reaction against that kind of world.
New York City would also be the inspiration for the band's name.
Possibly more than any other band, they were influenced by other forms of art as well as other forms of music. And you know, obviously there's a huge element of pulp fiction in there. Even in their very title, that was a book. The Velvet Underground was a book about the sort of secret subculture of New York.
The early incarnation of the band's sound was changed by the inclusion of guitarist Sterling Morrison and drummer Maureen Tucker, whose style was very much her own.
Maureen Tucker was a great art statement, wasn't she? You can imagine, even pre-Warhol, in the days of the Café Bazaar, how brilliant it would have looked to have a girl drummer on stage. I mean, people thought that was amazing about Jack White in 2005, that he had Meg on drums.
It's that thing where everyone's following the drums and the drums are doing something very primal, very simplistic and very direct, and everyone is just doing the same thing. All the instruments on that record are all doing the same thing. And that all stems from Mo Tucker's primitive drumming.
She didn't use snares, she used tom-toms. There were very few cymbals, so it wasn't a very sibilant, sustained sound. It was much more tribal. And along with the drone that they used in their first album, that is what you associate that band with, is that sort of almost African-sounding thing. So she brought a lot of style, but she also brought a bit of substance as well.
Change was also afoot for the band when New York City's prominent artist Andy Warhol watched them perform.
I believe that what happened is the Velvet Underground were playing in a place called the Dom, which was a Polish community centre in Lower Manhattan. Andy Warhol had already set up the factory by then, and he and the filmmaker Paul Morrissey were looking to find a band, Velvet Underground, who were playing, and they went down to see him.
Meeting Andy Warhol for the Velvet Underground had a huge impact on their image, on their sound, and also just in the general direction. He ended up becoming their manager, so I think he had a huge say in kind of what happened with the band and which direction they were going in.
I think Lou Reed has a very good line in Andy's influence on them. He knows that they would never have been in existence without Andy Warhol. He points out the fact that they got gigs because Andy Warhol had gallery openings and he brought this band along, he got them record contracts. And he sort of rather poetically describes Warhol as the big guard dog looking after them in those early days, or the umbrella that protected them from the press.
So I think what Andy Warhol did is he had the vision to make sure that they were left alone, to make sure that they were allowed to make that album and allowed to get all those ideas in and allowed to express themselves as fully as they did.
Warhol brought in German actress and singer Nico to front the band. They reluctantly took her in.
Nico was a brilliant move, really. Warhol said, we need a femme fatale. And so they got this woman, they stuck her in, and they made her sing a song called Femme Fatale. It was an extremely self-conscious thing to do. But there was nothing quite like Nico, because she had this poise and this absolute icy glacial calm, but she was also extremely clunky and silly, because the way she sang was ridiculous. There's that line in Femme Fatale, she'll bring you down, what a clown, and that's what, it made everyone laugh. It was the oddest juxtaposition of clunky girliness and a model's beauty.
What a clown, 'cause everybody knows.
Nico went on to become a real icon as a result of her work with the Velvet Underground, and I think the thing about her is that her voice just absolutely stops you in the tracks. And it's a really interesting combination of kind of sad and kind of emotional, but also robotic as well at the same time, and kind of otherworldly. So it's such an amazing voice. I don't think to this day now you've ever had a voice quite like it.
Under Warhol, the band recorded their debut, The Velvet Underground and Nico. Warhol created the now iconic artwork of a peelable yellow banana.
Shiny, shiny, shiny boots of leather. Whiplash, girl child in the dark.
I think Venus in Furs is by far my favourite Velvet Underground track. It's just that kind of beautiful melody, but also the weird kind of droning sound, that strange kind of, I think it's a viola, these kind of strange stabs that come in. It still sounds freaky and beautiful now when you hear it.
The Velvet Underground's debut album is definitely my favourite. It's got tons of iconic songs on there. And that union of Nico and her sort of very laconic sexuality with their sort of very gritty Lower East Side rock is just unbelievable.
The costumes she shall wear.
It just shows that there are all these elements that contribute to such an incredibly varied and enticing a record.
Severin, Severin, awaits you there.
The album's gritty lyrics were epitomized in the song I'm Waiting for the Man.
I'm waiting for my man.
Obviously, Waiting for the Man, quite an honest account of going up to Harlem to buy heroin. Feel sick and dirty, more dead than alive. It's quite moving in a way, because so many people from that world actually became victims of heroin, from Nico to Eric Emerson, who was the guy on the back of the album that was withdrawn.
In today's modern context, you know, when you've got gangster rap and all that kind of thing, where it's just, that kind of thing has permeated popular culture to such a ludicrous extent. At that time, to write a song about going out into Harlem and scoring drugs was just quite, to say the least, an outlandish thing to write a song about.
Upon its initial release, however, the Velvet Underground and Nico was a commercial failure, and tensions began to show in the relationship between the band and Warhol.
It didn't sell at the time, and people always think it didn't sell because it was an underrated classic. It actually didn't sell because it was withdrawn from sale, because it had a photograph on the back that someone was trying to get Andy Warhol to pay rights for. So it was really, ironically, Warhol's involvement with the band that drew that album back off sale and meant that it sold about 30,000 copies when it came out.
Sunday morning brings the dawn in.
With the Velvet Underground and Andy Warhol at that stage, there were unquestionably a lot of drugs involved and unquestionably a lot of big egos involved. They would have probably been trying to play one and off against each other, and that would have, you know, all of these factors would have resulted in a kind of intense paranoia that is not going to be healthy for anyone, and was probably the reason why they parted ways at this point.
Watch out!
The legend has it that Warhol appeared late to a gig with Nico and still insisted that she go on stage with the rest of them, even though they'd already started playing, and Lou Reed got fed up with this and said this is too much. I mean, it may have just been ambitions pulling in different directions. Warhol wanting to go one way, notoriously a whirlwind kind of guy who would pick people up, be interested in them and then move on. And then obviously you have Reed, who wanted to have commercial success and probably realised that he couldn't be branded with this movement forever and actually have any sense of longevity as a musician. He needed to get out, get away from Warhol, get away from Nico and write songs that were going to sell.
In 1967, the Velvet Underground began their second album, White Light, White Heat, without the involvement of Andy Warhol and Nico. With its more abrasive sound, like its predecessor, it would go on to inspire a new musical movement.
A number by a guy that is in London somewhere making an album, and I think he's a friend of mine. But anyway, he's one of the best songwriters around today. His name's Lou Reed, and this is one of his early things. It's called White Light, White Heat.
White light, white light, gonna drive me out of my brain. White light.
Bowie covered White Light, White Heat quite early on. A lot of musicians around the time were more switched on to the Velvets than perhaps the public in, you know, further afield were.
Suddenly there was this new crop of bands, whether it was the Sex Pistols or Television or, you know, Patti Smith or, you know, that whole new wave of New York bands who were taking bits and pieces from the Velvet Underground and reworking them into their own music, and they were becoming more successful on a worldwide scale. And then people were going back to Velvet Underground records and being like, wow, this is amazing.
A huge amount of acts of Underground influence. I think you wouldn't have had the kind of New York punk side of things. You wouldn't have had the Ramones. You wouldn't have had Television. You also probably wouldn't have had, we're looking more recently now, bands like the Strokes are hugely indebted to the Velvet Underground. There's so many acts that have just taken that sound. There's such a range of acts that they've influenced over the years, and it's interesting that a lot of those bands actually sound quite different to each other, but they still have that common thread which is linked by the Velvet Underground.
White Light, White Heat, it's not quite as perfectly formed as the first album is. It's much more of a kind of mess, but a mess in a good way. I mean, there's definitely a lot of tension in it. You can almost feel people pushing and pulling against each other within it and trying to find their roles, and that their roles constantly changing within what the band was.
Soon after White Light, White Heat, John Cale parted ways with the band. He was replaced by Doug Yule.
I remember reading that John Cale had said that Lou Reed was always a very angry character, and that even in their very earliest meetings he would talk about his problems with society and the world as though he was trying to prove his own personality within that anger. No one ever quite knows why this rift between them happened, but I believe that there was a suggestion that Cale just wanted the music to become more and more experimental. He wanted to work with amps underwater to see what effect that might create. And Lou Reed was a jobbing songwriter and essentially wanted to have hits, and that might have been where they parted company.
Reed, now without Cale, took the band through 2 more albums, the self-titled The Velvet Underground and Loaded.
I think symbolically, when you've had a few albums and then you come out with one and you name it after your band, you're saying, this is what we're about. It's very much a possessive move. You can hear that he's not on that record anymore. That drone is gone, for instance. We've got some very radio-friendly songs. And I remember Maureen saying that there was a real sense of calm, creative contentment on that album. And it may not be the classic that the first one was, but in some ways it's a lot more of a happy listen.
Loaded came about because a guy had come in at their label and had insisted that all these kind of experimental bands had to be culled and got rid of. They re-signed, and the label requested that they made an album loaded with hits to just kind of establish them as a force, hence the title Loaded. Loaded
had Rock and Roll and Sweet Jane, which are 2 of the most covered Velvet Underground songs and still the ones that you hear most on the radio, and I think it just follows that once he'd actually achieved that with that album, he'd think, okay, right, now's the time for the solo work.
Lou Reed left just before the record came out, and he was disillusioned with it, and I think he was already starting to think about going solo.
Just a perfect day. Drink sangria in the park. And then later, when it gets dark, we go home.
His solo catalogue is so varied, from things like Sally Can't Dance to Metal Machine Music, which is just, extreme noise. Transformer is a brilliant album, and things like Walk on the Wild Side is just really inventive, but at the same time immediate and addictive pop music.
Oh, it's such a perfect day. I'm glad I spent it with you.
There's a huge amount of really great work in there. And I think he deserves to be recognised as much for that as he does for his work in the Velvets.
Without Reed, Doug Yule took the lead for the Velvet Underground's last recording, 1973's Squeeze.
By the 5th album, Lou Reed had left, John Cale had left, Doug Yule had kind of taken over the main kind of duties of the Velvet Underground, but to me this isn't a Velvet Underground album at all. It's maybe Velvet Underground in name, and that's it.
It was all basically taken under the wing of Doug Yule, who plays half a dozen instruments. And as a piece of music, it's not terrible. It's got a real crazy Beatles Badfinger kind of feeling about it. There are songs on there that sound like When I'm 64, there's a song called Mean Old Man. It just sounds like the end of the 60s, really. But the funny thing was that they got people turning out in droves to see that band, even though it didn't have Reed or Cale in it anymore, because by that point the mythology of that group was starting to become so strong.
Although the band achieved no immediate success in their career, they are now regarded as one of the most influential bands of all time, and Nico, Cale and Reed each enjoyed solo success on the back of its legacy.
The Velvet Underground were never going to be one of those heritage bands. They're never going to be the Rolling Stones who are playing in 50 years' time. They were of their era. They were ephemeral. They were going to blaze out.
I think the success of the Velvet Underground was just purely because it took that much time for these songs to get out there. Desert Shore and the Marble Index, they were underground records. John Cale making Paris 1990, not really huge. Lou Reed made Transformer, that was the big one. So that all helped, and I think maybe people then did go back and discover the Velvet Underground, but it was really, you had people like David Bowie eulogizing about them the whole time, and that's how do you discover music? Your heroes talk about something and you start digging deeper.
those bands around whom the legend is stronger now, even than it was 10 years after they disbanded. Any art movement takes on greater cohesion and meaning the further away you get from it. And people like Cale and Reed are now a direct lifeline to something as important as the Beat movement or the Bloomsbury set. You can't believe that they're actually still around and that they knew these people when people like Warhol and Nico are gone.
Those records are so good. I think they're just perfect songs, really. Perfect albums in many ways. They're just going to get out sooner or later. It just happened that they didn't get out in their time for whatever reason.
They will become more and more legendary as they get older. They must be 70 years old now, and they'll still be turning out when they're 80 to deliver important addresses on the symbolism of that time.
Brian Eno famously said that, you know, the Velvet Underground may have only sold 30,000 records, but those 30,000 people who bought that record all went off and formed bands. And what he's saying there is that the Velvet Underground are hugely influential, and you can see their DNA and their lineage in bands in New York in the 70s, but also in bands like The Strokes and, you know, bands that are popular today. So they really were hard-hitting with their music.